Day 7 of the 2024 U.S. Senior and U.S. Junior Championships saw some wild results as the players enter the final stretch of their tournament. Starting with the U.S. Senior, Vladimir Akopian drew his game against Melik Khachiyan, maintaining his 1.5 point lead with 2 rounds to go. Akopian has 5.5 out of 7, while Grandmasters Julio Becerra, Joel Benjamin, and Jesse Kraai all trail with 4. In the U.S. Junior, top seed and leader Christopher Yu also drew his game against one of his main rivals in Justin Wang. This allowed Jason Wang to close the distance after a shocking blunder from Arthur Guo. Also winning was Andrew Hong, who converted a very long rook endgame as he and Jason Wang now both trail Christopher Yu by half a point. Finally, in the U.S. Girls Junior, the co-leaders Alice Lee and Rose Atwell both managed to win their games in quite dramatic fashion, extending their lead as they're now both on 5 out of 7 with 2 rounds to go. Jumping into the games, we'll start with the U.S. Senior, with the key game being Akopian against Khachiyan here. And in this one, Melik opts for a surprise in the opening, the Petrov defense. After knight takes e5, he goes knight takes e4. Now this one has long been thought to be unplayable for black after queen to e2. If black's knight moves away, then white wins material with knight c6 check. But in recent years, they've discovered that this position is actually quite playable for black, as queen e7 is played, queen takes e4, and d6, known as the Damiano Petrov. The point is black wins back the piece on e5 due to the pin on e4. Now white can get an extra pawn here after d4, but black gets some nice compensation here. Knight c6, bishop b5, bishop d7, and black is ready to castle queenside. In this game, Akopian tries to play it safe with castles, knight c3, knight takes e5, and here Melik is able to equalize. Takes on d7, white plays queen to g4, h5, queen h3, queen to b4, queen to f5, hitting this one. Black played bishop to c5, knight e4. Perhaps black could have gotten a bit of an edge here with g6, although I think white is still okay after queen f4. Instead, we saw rook e8, allowing white to bail out, knight takes c5, heading into a very, very equal endgame, bishop versus knight, but yeah, neither side can really fight for much of an advantage here, as black is very, very solid. All the rooks came off in this one, and the players did eventually agree to a draw. Moving on to the U.S. Junior, here the leader Christopher Yu had white in today's game against Justin Wang. Going into the round was a point behind. Christopher goes for the Vienna game, definitely a surprise here. And quickly, the two players get quite an unbalanced position. After c5, queen f2, queen to g3. It seemed like white might have had a bit of pressure out of the opening here, but black manages to solve all of his problems. Here, white plays the move queen f4. The engines suggest bishop to c4 here, where after b5, the idea is to just drop back with bishop to e2. And apparently white has a bit of an initiative here playing against this pawn. Instead, we saw queen to f4, bishop takes g5, knight g5, queen c7, g3, castles. Now once again, bishop to g2, the engines claim white has a small edge. Instead, we saw a trade on e6, bishop h3. As the players get into this bishop versus knight endgame, white gives up a pawn temporarily, wins it back with the rook e1, and the two players found themselves in this endgame, rook and bishop against rook and knight. Objectively, this one was very, very close to equal, but this game actually went on for some time as Christopher was looking to make the most of his chances with the bishop against the knight. Now, he does manage to snag a pawn here, but of course, since white's pawns are doubled, this extra pawn is not so valuable. Black gets the pawn back on h5, white takes on c4. And we get this endgame where, again, white is up a pawn, but it's unclear how useful this extra pawn is, of course, because the c-pawns are doubled. But the engines did like white's position here, although somewhere Christopher does go wrong. Apparently rook a4 here was close to winning. But the two players, of course, not being engines, not being able to play perfect chess. We get a very, very human fight here as white looks to slowly grind. But for the most part, Justin defended this one very well. Now he gets counterplay with knight to d1. And eventually, this game did end up being drawn as the pawns come off here. Rook check. I think this was maybe the last moment. Bishop takes a6, might have been giving away all the advantage rook to g6 check, king to c7, rook takes g5, and white can certainly continue to play this one on for some time with, again, the extra pawn. Instead, we saw takes on a6, rook to b6. Of course, if black were to take this bishop, there'd be rook g6 check, winning the rook and the game. But instead, rook to b6, threatening a perpetual knight b1, knight to c3. White gives some checks, bishop to b5, and of course the game here finally liquidates as the players trade everything off and the game is drawn. So with this draw by Christopher, that takes him to 5.5 out of 7, and that allowed a couple players to catch up to be within a half point of him with going into the final 2 rounds. First up, we have Jason Wang, who's actually under serious pressure here against Arthur Guo, ends up getting a very, very lucky break in this game. Here in this position, white has sacrificed a pawn, but is doing quite well as black's king here is weak. Already in this position, white could play the move rook to b8 check, hitting the rook on g8. And the point here is that if black gives up the queen for the 2 rooks, which black will basically have to do, after a move like queen to e7 here, white's queen is very, very strong, and white has a huge, huge advantage in this position. Instead, Arthur plays the move c3. Black plays rook to g7. Now, once again, rook b8 check would have been nice for white. Instead, we see rook to d1, queen to e7, black looking to trade the queens. And here, something strange happened. The game actually abruptly ended without white making another move. Apparently, what had happened is that Arthur intended to play the move rook to d8 check, with the idea that if black takes this one with the queen, there's rook to b8 check, white wins the queen for the 2 rooks, and again we have this position where white is doing well, but he simply forgot that after rook to d8 check, black can actually take this one with the king, and that's just a free rook. So realizing his blunder, Arthur simply resigned on the spot, and with that, Jason managed to win the game, get to 5 out of 7, as he is just a half point behind Christopher Yu. Also getting to within a half point was Andrew Hong, who managed to win this very difficult rook endgame against Jason Liang. This one objectively is a draw with white having just 1 extra pawn. The problem is that black's rook here is incredibly active, getting behind the a pawn and putting pressure on g2. But Andrew plays this one for quite some time and does manage to generate some chances. So he starts off by bringing the king over to the queen side, pushes a7 so that black can never take one of these pawns on the king side. And here comes a very, very long battle where white's king starts to come up. And the reason this one is drawn is because whenever the king approaches the pawn, black is just going to give checks from behind. And there's no way for white to hide from the checks, no way to promote the pawn. Black just keeps the rook on the a file. And yeah, white is never able to get the rook off of a8. However, Hong keeps trying here. King to e5, check, king e6, another check. And white could have taken that pawn on f5. He ends up taking it later on. It actually doesn't change the evaluation of the position because still white's rook is buried on a8 and he can push his pawn all the way up to g6, but black will simply ignore it and there's no way for white to make progress. So game continues here as Hong keeps trying to maneuver around with the king, looking for any chance possible. And he eventually takes it. After a lot of checks, he goes rook to d8. The point being black can win the pawn on a7, but now white plays king to e6, threatening a rook d7 check. That will be a winning king and pawn endgame, so black avoids it with a rook a4, and now check. And here, basically any move is holding for black. I think king to g8 would have been totally fine, king f8 as well. Black instead comes up king to g6, which is definitely okay, but now things get a little tricky here. After h5, king g5, rook g7, and king f5. It's 2 versus 1, and these endgames are always drawn, but now black's king is a little bit off sides, and things turn out to be not so easy. And this is where Jason goes wrong. He gives check on a5, king f6. And already here, it's very, very difficult to hold it. Black would have to find the move rook a4, where after something like rook to g6, black would then have to find the only move rook a7. Otherwise, white would play king g7, king takes h6, picking up the second extra pawn. Here, after rook to a7, black is still holding the draw, though of course anything could still happen in under the time pressure. Instead, after rook a5 check, king f6, black gives another check, and now this is officially winning for white, as after king to f7, black can no longer stop the king getting around. So rook a8 is played, stopping king g8, but now rook to g6, threatening king to g7 and taking the pawn. Black gives check, king to g8, king to g3, but now rook to g7, and this is the key problem for black. If the rooks get traded, then that's a winning king and pawn endgame for white. After takes, king takes h6, king f5, white is king to g7, and black is not in time. And otherwise, white is playing king h7, rook g6, and then taking the second pawn. So that's what happened after check, king f4, rook to g6, king takes h6. Hong was able to win the second pawn, get his king out, and of course, the rest was just a matter of technique, with white winning with his passed h-pawn. So huge result there from Andrew Hong. I'll just show folks how exactly black could have held this endgame, because it is quite instructive. Instead of giving this check, which I think makes things a bit tricky for black, just keeping the rook on the 4th rank would have held the draw. The point is that white cannot really cross over king to g6 because black will take on g4. And if something like king f6, well, black can give a check, let's say king to e7, and black can take in this position, as well as just keeping still on the 4th rank, and black should be holding this endgame. So full credit to Andrew there for grinding out the win and keeping pressure on his opponent until he was finally able to pick up the full point, as he now also trails Christopher Yu by just a half point with 2 rounds left to play. Next up in the U.S. Girls Junior, we had 2 critical games. First off, Alice White against Jasmine Su. Jasmine was the early tournament leader, leading after 4 rounds in this event, but has since struggled, losing a couple games. In this one, she was doing fine against Alice in this Fianchetto Grunfeld. Black, for the most part, was able to solve all her difficulties in this position. However, the game continues for quite some time and eventually does see some complications. For bishop to d2, bishop to f1. Alice was doing okay here, a little bit on the back foot as she tries to keep black's counterplay under control. e5, very nice break from black, looking to create a weakness on d4. Now rook e8, queen d2. Here the rooks come off, knight c3, and the knights get traded off as well. In this position, basically very much equal. However, Jasmine, with not much time left on her clock, just a couple minutes, makes a serious mistake here with the move g4. White takes on g4, and it's possible black overlooked is that if she takes this one back, and after trades, queen d8 check, white picks up the pawn on d5. Now, this position may still be difficult for white to win, but it is an extra pawn. And instead, Jasmine goes for bishop to c2, but now queen to c3, check, bishop f3, and bishop e4. And here, white's a pawn up, but it's really not so clear as the pawn isn't very valuable. King to g2. And actually, black didn't have to do anything special here. For example, trading is apparently close to equal here. She goes f5, which is also fine. Takes, queen to e3. Now the move h5 would have kept the position within reason. Or again, white is up a pawn, but really not easy to convert the extra pawn on the king side. Very hard to push this one. Instead, we see bishop takes f3, a trade on f3, queen takes, queen c2 check. This ends up being the losing move. Black had to just keep the queen on e6 here, because after check, the issue is that the d-pawn is now very difficult to defend. Black gives another check here, brings the queen back to g5, but now queen to g4. Trading queens here is a losing endgame for black. White's king is too quick, and white is winning the bishop endgame. So queen e3 was played, and queen f6, and then white would still have some work to do here in order to convert this one. King to g2, I think, is a good start. Yeah, here at this point might just be a matter of technique. However, black could at least defend for a little bit of time there. After queen e3, white is able to pick up the d-pawn with check, and now this d-pawn is way too strong, and this is what Alice uses to win her the game. Queen e3, b4, cementing the bishop on c5. Black takes on a3, but now d5, the d-pawn runs, and this is simply too difficult for black to deal with. The game ended after d6, queen f6. Alice simply trades queens here, plays bishop to b6, and black resigned as the d-pawn is promoting, and black is going to have to give up the bishop for it. For example, d7 here, king f7, white promotes, takes, and the bishop can cover the a5 square. White's king will come in, and of course, white will win with their extra pawn on the king side. So huge win for Alice, as with this game, she took the clear lead in the tournament, which of course did not last long, as Rose Atwell still had chances to tie with Alice if she could win this game against Yasmin Asani. And this one was quite a barn burner, starting off from the London opening, excuse me, and castles bishop d3. And here actually black got a very reasonable position right from the opening. Takes, knight e5. It looks like white is doing good with the knight on e5, but c5, and black actually is able to get some nice counterplay on the queen side, starting with this push that we see with c4. So white makes a bunch of moves on the king side looking to advance, but now knight to d7 and f6 here. Very, very nice move from Rose, taking away the outpost from white's knights. Knight d3, c4, white is forced to go backwards. And now black's queenside play actually ends up being quite annoying here, where the kingside play for white doesn't go very far. f5, g5, and now b4. And at this point, black is actually taking over. Queen to a4, takes, overwhelming strategic advantage here for black. c3 is coming, the a2 pawn is hanging. And this is what caused Yasmin to sacrifice on d5, looking to change the character of the position. So white gives up a knight, but does get 3 pawns for it. Still a winning position for black, as white's pawns aren't particularly strong and black's pieces should eventually come out. However, the game got very, very messy here. Queen takes a2, b3, knight to e6, rook e1, and now knight takes f4. Rose takes the wrong pawn. She should have taken on d4. Then black is completely winning here as the pieces are taking over. Instead, we saw knight takes f4, which is actually a blunder because queen f3 hits the knight comes back to g6, and now rook a1. And all of a sudden, after queen c2, rook a c1, black's queen is short on squares. And it looks like black might be forced to go in for a perpetual after queen a2, rook a1, and so on. Rose, of course, doesn't want the draw. She plays for the win with knight takes h4. And it's hard to see what's actually wrong with this move. Knight takes h4. Remember, black is up a piece. Black counterattacks the queen on f3. If rook takes c2, knight takes f3 check. And then black wins the rook on e1. So that's completely winning. And it looks like everything is okay. It turns out white had an amazing move here. Queen to c6, which would have changed everything in this game. Stunning move, very, very difficult to see during the game. No one is giving you a hint that you have some move to find. The point is that white is hitting the rook on c8, the rook on b5, the queen on c2 is still under attack. You can't take the queen because of rook e8 mate on the board. And after queen c6, the only move for black to just not resign immediately is to drop back with this rook, rook bb8, keeping the attack on the queen. But here white would have rook e8 check, sacrificing the rook to distract the rook off of the c file. Finally, rook takes c2, white could take the queen, and apparently white is better in this resulting position. Not hard to believe. White's queen is very, very strong, and black only has a rook and knight for it. So very, very tough resource missed likely by both players here. Instead, white goes queen to g3, letting Rose back into the game with f4. Very, very nice move. If white takes this one on f4, that allows the queen to get back into the game. So queen f5 here, for example, black would be winning. Even stronger is rook takes g5 check. The idea after queen takes g5, knight f3 check. And for example, king to h1 here, black can play knight takes g5, rook takes c2, knight takes c1, keeping the extra knight in the endgame with a decisive advantage. After f4, white takes on h4, and now the move queen f5 would have been very, very strong for black, setting up knight takes g5, where there's a ton of threats against white's king. Instead, Rose takes on b3, which basically lets white back into the game once again. Knight to e5, rook f8, queen to g4, and now white has plenty of activity against black's king. Black is still up a pawn here, but it really doesn't matter as white's pieces are very, very active. So this one goes into a very sharp, heavy piece endgame. Rook c8, b3, Rose looking to win with her passed b pawn. White looking to generate enough counterplay against black's king in the meantime. So queen d7, rook b8, e6 now, queen f5, rook to c1. Queen takes g5, apparently a huge mistake. The engines were saying h6. This move is winning for black, creating luft for the king. If g takes h6, for example, then there's queen to g6 check, followed by b2. Good luck finding all this when you're just down to a couple minutes. So takes on g5 was played king f1, queen to d8, white gives a check. And now at this point, e7 was basically necessary, just pushing the e pawn forward, and creating some counterplay. If queen e8, white's queen can drop back, queen takes f4, and the game remains very, very unclear. Instead, we saw rook to c7, which ends up being a losing blunder by Asani, as Rose now finds queen d1 check, queen g4 check, covering g7, and now if the king moves over to the h-file, black can play f3, and white simply has no defense here to queen to g2 mate. White has to give the queen, and of course, it's all over. Instead, king f1 was played, but now simply b2, and unfortunately for white, she's not in time. She has no good checks. The e-pawn is too slow. Black is next promoting the second queen and mating white. So with this one, Rose was able to keep pace with Alice Lee by winning this game, as the two players are now both on 5 out of 7, a full 1.5 points ahead of the rest of the field. So the U.S. Girls Junior Championship definitely going to come down to these two players. That takes us into tomorrow's penultimate round 8. We have two very exciting and dramatic rounds, I'm sure, coming up ahead of us. So hopefully we'll catch you back here for the recap. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.